Very definitely, in terms of biblical law, the law of restitution, we must, each of us, pay for our own sins. This is inescapable. In the justice of God, every man must pay for his own sins. But because men are inescapably interrelated and interconnected in their lives, and that no man can live unto himself, others pay for our sins as well. This is inescapable. So that the consequences of sin linger very, very definitely, and others suffer for them. For example, if a child in a family, as so many cases all of us could cite, illustrate, becomes a hippie and becomes involved in narcotics and becomes venereally diseased, you name it. Virtually all of us have encountered very tragic situations like that. That child suffers. But think of the suffering for the parents and the brothers and sisters. It's a real agony. So that the penalty of sin affects others than the one person who sins. Consider, for example, our history and how we have suffered for the sins of our fathers. George Mason of Virginia had more to do with the writing of the Constitution in 1787 than any other single man. Portion after portion is his handiwork. And yet in the last days of the convention, he left and went home, sick at heart, and refused to sign it, and fought against it together with Patrick Henry. It meant disagreeing with one of his very closest and dearest friends, George Washington, who wanted him, in spite of the problem, to come out and support it. But he couldn't. Why? In the last days, there was a swap between the North and the South. There were several points, but two chief points. First, Mason, although he was a slave owner, wanted slavery to be abolished gradually. Could be done very simply in a number of ways, that after such and such a year, all children who were born of slaves would become free. This wouldn't dislocate the economy or cause harm to anyone. He wanted that. He felt it was very necessary. Then he felt that the federal government should have nothing to do with interstate commerce. To give it any power to regulate interstate commerce would be to make it not a federal union, but ultimately a totalitarian state. So the northern states said, if you will allow the regulation of interstate commerce, we will allow slavery to continue. And that swap was consummated in the last days of the Constitutional Convention. And all the powers of the federal government have grown out of that. Both the way slavery was abolished through the 14th Amendment and the Interstate Commerce Clause. Mason was right. He felt it would produce a fearful harvest for the country, that the country had so glorious a future, and he felt it was sin, a very real sin, to make that kind of compromise. Now, you see, we've paid for it, haven't we? The problems that the country has had from 1860 to the present day are all products of that sin there. So, they didn't pay for their sins just by themselves. We're paying for it, and God alone knows how long we'll go on paying for the sin that was committed there. So sin does have more than personal effects. If a man starts a fire in a building, in an apartment house, consider the effects it has on more than himself. Sin, therefore, has far-reaching consequences. And in Adam's sin, we were all involved. So we pay for our sins, but others pay for them also.